Once there was a war like none other ever before, a war cloaked in darkness, lit only by flares and searchlights, the explosions of bombs and the blaze of burning planes. For the first time in the history of human conflict, a war was fought between men and machines at night. It became a battle of electronics and technology, where the testing ground was the dark skies of Europe, and the cost of failure was the lives of young men. Armed with neither the experience nor the equipment to fight a war in the air at night, the air crews relied on themselves, their planes, and eventually the science of death. These battles would forever change the way man waged war.
I think, the story of Bomber Command in general is an incredible one. When you look at their record and you look at the losses they suffered.
In the early years of the war, the Allied bombers were sustaining enormous losses at the hands of the German night fighters and their advanced air defense system. By the end of the war, Bomber Command would suffer a casualty rate of more than 50%. Losses surpassed only by the German U-boat service. Flying in bombers was a deadly proposition.
You would see aircraft striking the ground down below, which was quite a fiery occasion, on most occasions anyway. When they struck the ground, they just broke up and burned along. And at 18,000, 17,000 feet, it was quite visible to see this all happening.
Compounding the losses was the fact that over 2/3 of the bombers failed to come within 5 miles of their intended target. The technology used in navigation was at best simple, at worst, fatal.
When the bombing offensive began, I don't think anybody quite understood what the impact would be. And I don't mean from a strategic level, but just the mechanics of organizing a number of aircraft flying over a darkened continent.
As both sides raced to develop and apply new technologies to their war efforts, the German innovations in defending the dark skies over Europe were beginning to take effect. The culmination of their defensive system was a series of boxes created across the continent.
The system we call the Raumnachtjagd with boxes. So you had to fly a certain heading, and then you were in contact, with the help of the radio operator, of course, in contact with the ground control officer. Then I was on my own, and I had to follow him.
Himmelbett, which translated means heavenly four-poster bed, was based on the 4 pillars of the German air defense system: flak, searchlights, ground control, and night fighters.
What they did was they set up radar installations for each of these night fighter boxes, and the controller on the ground would vector the night fighter into an intercept position below and behind the bomber, again within this 20-mile by 40-mile box.
The heart of the German system was the giant Würzburg radar. These would send out signals which would tell the ground controllers the altitude and distance of the incoming planes. This information would be then given to the searchlights and the flak batteries, who would try to shoot them out of the sky.
So long as the British were using a make-your-own-way method of flying to the target, you very often only had one bomber in one night fighter box at any one time.
The Germans took their scientific developments and formed them into the tools of war. This created the foundation for the unlikely team of night fighter and ground controller.
Leitoffizier war natürlich oft auf dem sogenannten Gruppengefechtsstand und kannte die Flugzeugführer, die er später mal an den Bomber heranführen sollte. Und während des Sprechverkehrs wusste jeder, dass er sich auf den anderen verlassen konnte.
I was directed towards those bombers, and then we picked them up with our small equipment we had on the Messerschmitt 110.
Not only did technology like searchlights and radar work against the bomber crews, often it appeared that Mother Nature was fighting for the other side as well.
You had a moonlight night, then you just suck out like a sore thumb. And the fighters would get at you pretty easy that way.
As an 18-year-old tail gunner in an aging Whitley bomber, Fred Passmore was introduced to the German night fighters on his first operation over the darkened continent.
I did not see the outline totally of the aircraft, but I did see a flashing light. It blinked 3 times. But on that first blink, I reacted in fear. I jerked back on the controls of the aircraft, or the gun turret. My fingers were on the triggers, the guns went off, and it's like anything else, those bullets had to go somewhere, and they went into that aircraft.
After the burst from his 303 machine guns, Passmore saw the aircraft explode on impact with the ground below. After the initial adrenaline rush, the emotional impact set in.
I was scared to death that I had perhaps shot and nailed one of our own aircraft. So that when I got back and we were being debriefed by the intelligence people, I hesitated in telling them what I had done.
In fact, Passmore learned later that day he had shot down a German night fighter. He was credited with a probable on his first operation. The Allied bombers, in an attempt to outflank the Himmelbett defenses, tried to fly around them. The Germans responded by extending the Himmelbett zones from Jutland through Holland and into France, the obvious points of ingress into the continent. The Allies needed to develop a method to counter the effectiveness of the German defensive systems. By May of 1942, there was considerable doubt in the Allied command as to whether the bomber offensive was going to do what had been promised. The tremendous losses and the bombers' inability to hit targets put the likelihood of future bombing and bomber production at risk.
Harris decided that he would put on one grand show, what he called Operation Millennium, putting 1,000 bombers over the same city on the same night within a very, very concentrated period of time.
Air Marshal Harris hoped that the symbol of 1,000 bombers attacking in one night at one target would overwhelm the German Himmelbett defenses. The largest air armada the world had ever seen saved the bombing offensive. The Allies were about to change tactics that would alter the war.
The idea of the bomber stream was developed mainly to defend the bomber stream rather than to increase the impact of bombing. It was a defensive measure intended to overwhelm this very rigid Himmelbett German night air defense system. That's why it was introduced. And the fact that it was introduced on a night when Bomber Command was going to throw 1,000 bombers at the target was for PR purposes.
Wir hatten zu der Zeit das Himmelbettverfahren. Vielleicht kommen wir noch darauf, wo immer nur ein Jäger in einem bestimmten Raum jagen durfte. Nun das ging, solange einzelne Bomber kamen. Da konnte man die erfassen und auch von einem Himmelbett zum anderen weiterreichen. Jetzt kam aber plötzlich ein Strom an. Und da funktionierte unser Himmelbettverfahren überhaupt nicht mehr.
The Millennium Raid was part PR effort and in part to relieve some of the pressure that the Germans were putting on the Soviets. The battle for Stalingrad had taken an enormous toll on the Soviet and German armies. By taking the war to the continent, it was, in a manner, the only way of striking back. The new tactic of the bomber stream overwhelmed the German defenses.
Der zweite Rückschlag war der, dass überhaupt die große Zahl der Ziele schwerer zu erfassen war und schwerer zu bekämpfen war. Und die Bomberstrom sich ja auch noch teilte auf mehrere Ziele, während das vorher mehr oder weniger klar war, auf welches Ziel angeflogen wurde.
Critical in this new success was the development of Allied large four-engined bombers, such as the Lancaster and the Halifax. Their eventual payloads of over 20,000 pounds of bombs gave the bomber streams unprecedented impact on their targets. To counter the bomber stream, the Germans' response was led by Joseph Kammhuber, the commander of the German night defenses.
Kammhuber forderte, ganz Deutschland mit einer Zone von Himmelbetträumen zu bedecken. Er forderte Tausende von neuen Funkmessgeräten an und einige zigtausend neue Soldaten oder Helfer, zum Teil auch Frauen, die in Uniform Funkgeräte bedienten, Soldaten entlasteten mit weniger wichtigen Aufgaben.
Kammhuber wanted to cover not only the whole of Germany, but occupied Europe and Africa as well.
Dieses System konnte die Industrie nicht beliefern.
On May 30th, 1942, the first 1,000 bomber raid on Germany was to have a devastating effect. Cologne was bombed in a manner that no city had ever experienced.
We cannot send 1,000 bombers a time over Germany every time as yet. But the time will come when we can do so. It may take a year, it may take 2. But for the Nazis, the writing is on the wall.
Flying one of the new four-engined Lancasters, Bill Randall would complete over 30 operations as a Lanc pilot.
It was obedient. It didn't have any faults. It was a forgiving aircraft. There wasn't much room in them, you know, for the crew and so on, because it certainly wasn't a commercial aircraft. It was designed for carrying a heavy bomb load only.
The Lancaster eventually carried the 22,000-pound tall boy bomb filled with high explosive. As a strategic bomber, its 4 Merlin engines could take it to targets deep into the German heartland.
I was quite pleased every time I came back to base that our Lanc had taken us there and back.
With fighters unable to escort the Lanc on its long missions, it was heavily armed with nose, mid-upper gun, and tail turrets. Each had at least 2 .303 caliber machine guns designed to persuade German night fighters to look for other targets.
It was contingent on the rear gunner never to drop his guard, so you were constantly looking out into the blackness and hoping that you would see nothing, but once you did, then to take that evasive action and save not only yourself, but the aircraft and the crew.
While its wingspan of over 100 feet could lift the bomber to new heights, the aircrew were still reliant on very simple navigation methods. Returning from a bombing mission in his Halifax, Bob Pratt's navigator, Willie, informed him they had made it home and were over England.
So I said, okay, and I let down through the clouds, and lo and behold, there's an aerodrome down below us. So I said, I was getting low on gas, so I thought, well, I'd land and fuel up and then come on home.
As he lined up his Halifax to land at the runway, they started to shoot at him.
So I fired off the colors of the day, and then I circled around and made another approach, and they did the same thing, but so I fired off the colors of the day again. As soon as they did that, they stopped shooting. So I said to Willie, I said, are you sure we're over England? So he said, well, just fly due north, I'll take an astro shot. I said, well, an astro shot and it's pouring rain? You're not even going to see a star.
Pratt then asked his wireless operator to try and get a vector onto the aircraft.
So he got a vector onto us, and they come back, and through the wireless op, they said we were trying to land on a German aerodrome.
Pratt pulled up his landing gear and headed due north towards England, and eventually landed at a fighter base on the South Shore.
We got home. I said to Willie, that's your last trip with me. So what they did, they gave him his commission and sent him home as a navigation instructor.
The bombers would soon get the help to not only find their targets, but also their way home. One of the critical developments of the electronic war was the development of a secret navigation aid, codenamed G. As with any technical innovation, it had its limits. The further you flew from England, the more obtuse the lines became from the bend in the horizon, and the easier it was for the Germans to jam. However, it did allow the Allies to deliver punishing air attacks to Essen and the Ruhr. The war continued to extract an enormous price, and the currency used was civilians. Peter Spoden was a young 17-year-old attending high school in Essen, Germany when the war broke out.
I volunteered for the Luftwaffe, and there I was asked, what do you like to become? A day fighter, a bomber, destroyer? I said, night fighter. I came from Essen. And as I said before, the British bombed already the town frequently, not seriously like later on. And I wanted to do something about it.
Spoden flew over 250 missions as a night fighter pilot. The Germans used 2 radars to shoot down the Allied bombers. To get the night fighters into a position in the sky where they could attack the Allied aircraft, the German ground controllers used the Würzburg radars. Once they got closer to their target, the German air crews depended on the Liechtenstein airborne radar to vector themselves into a firing position.
The idea was to fly in the direction where the British bombers were, and the radio operator could get on 3 tubes the distance, the direction, and the height.
The roads of technology took the Germans and Allies to different places. The British had developed centimetric radar. This was a magnetron which produced high-powered electromagnetic energy with a short wavelength of 10 centimeters. This allowed the small directional transmitter to be fitted inside the nose of the British night fighter aircraft. The Germans, however, developed their radar technology using the longer metric radar waves. This created the need for large, cumbersome antennae to be fitted on the nose of the aircraft. These antlers hampered not only their airworthiness, but slowed their airspeed by more than 26 miles per hour. In the dark battlefield of the European skies, every advantage or disadvantage could prove critical. The Junkers 88, fitted with its heavy array of antennae, could have 2 radar operators on board. They would use Liechtenstein to guide the night fighter onto the bomber.
He told me, well, I have a target now. It's about 3 kilometers, and more to the left, a little bit higher. 2 kilometers now, 1 kilometer, we are now pretty close, but you don't see him at 1,000 meters. You see in a dark night only, if you have a good night vision, about 200 meters. Only in the moonlight you can make it out of 800 meters if you're lucky.
The pilot had to develop an implicit level of trust with his operator, who was directing him through the blackened sky based on blips on the tube. It was critical as to where the operator directed the pilot, as the bomber crews were also looking for them as well. Surprise, one of the critical elements of any warfare, could fall to either side.
He must be above you. That was also a very good deal this man did, is that he brought me below, because there it is dark and here it is bright. The sky is always lighter than the ground.
By the end of the war, Spoden had over 24 confirmed kills. Today, he's going to do something he hasn't done in more than 50 years. Climb into a cockpit to intercept a Lancaster bomber.
I never seen in the air a Lancaster from that size and from that beautiful color. Probably we would be dead if we ever seen a ship like that.
Spoden is flying in an A-26 Intruder, an American twin-engined light bomber manufactured at the end of the war. The A-26 is standing in for the Junkers 88, one of the night fighters Spoden actually flew during the war. Armed with only his memories, Spoden takes to the skies in search of his former nemesis, the Lancaster. Today, over the shores of Lake Erie, Spoden is reenacting the interception of the Lancaster using Liechtenstein.
You can imagine in the night that the sky is lighter and brighter, but the British knew it. But they did not have guns below them. Below the Lancaster was completely without any guns from under.
The German night fighters attacked the lumbering Lancasters from below and behind. Spoden in the A-26 is carefully beginning his interception of the Lancaster.
There's a night fight, distance about 200 meters. The gunner can see us, and I can see him. Very dangerous moment for both of us. I had his weapons, weapons ready. Okay, we're coming from the rear. There's a plane coming in now, very close. You must be aware for the rear gunner. He could meet us every moment. And again, with upwards guns shooting. Turning to the left.
During the war, Spoden himself was shot down 4 times while tangling with the Allied bombers. While the air war was fought over night-covered Europe, the war of competing technologies continued in the laboratories of both sides. The use of one technology was guaranteed to elicit a response from the other side.
The Brits weren't stupid. They understood that once the Germans discovered the existence of G, they would do their utmost either to jam it or to bend it. And they gave themselves a 6-month time limit.
In fact, G lasted for 10 months before the Germans discovered it and neutralized it with jamming.
But by that time, the British had oboe ready to come into play. Oboe was different than G.
Oboe's strength was that you could accurately measure distance with radio. Using 2 stations over 100 miles apart, they would send out 2 signals. The bomber would fly down one towards the target, and when the 2 signals intersected, it marked the point to release the bombs.
Einige Fabriken sehr exakt getroffen wurden, konnte man sich bei der deutschen Luftwaffe nicht vorstellen, dass es sich um ein Zielnavigationsverfahren von höchster Präzision handelte. Und man glaubte immer, zumindest zunächst, dass unten in der Stadt, in der Nähe der Fabrik, ein Geheimsender einer Widerstandsorganisation, natürlich meistens wurde gesagt, es sind Kommunisten, die dort sitzen und mit einem Sender Peilsignale geben, um den Bomber heranzurufen.
The news that the Allies were hitting targets on cloudy nights infuriated Hitler. He summoned Goering and told him that it was a scandal that the British could do this while they, the Germans, could not. In fact, they had already used this technology with their X system during the Blitz.
Oboe also could be seen by the Germans, read by the Germans in electronic words, and the British anticipated that it would eventually be discovered and jammed or used in some other way, and eventually oboe was discovered by the Germans and jammed.
In addition to its vulnerability to jamming, oboe could only control a few aircraft at a time. This was impractical for the 1,000 bomber streams that Harris was sending, but ideal for the Pathfinders.
The idea was that elite crews, the best crews, would be concentrated in one bomber group. They would be sent out in advance of the main bomber stream. They would find, locate the target, and then using various colored flares, mark the target for the crews of the main force that came in afterward.
The crews had all in their briefing been told that the markers were red and green and something or other, because you had to be very careful because the Germans were on it very early, where they would put what they thought were similar things short of the target or way off to one side to try and attract the bombers.
Target indicators came in a variety of colors and with names to match their effect. The red blob, made up from a mixture of benzol, rubber phosphorus, and dyes, was packed into a 250-pound bomb case. The pink pansy was a 4,000-pound bomb which gave off an instantaneous pink flash.
Brought about greater accuracy on the target.
As the bombers reached further into the heart of Germany, the distance from the transmitters limited the G and oboe radio systems.
The ideal solution to help navigators find a city and a target at night in the dark was a blind bombing device, something that could transform the night into the day.
Codenamed H-2S was a downward-looking radar that scanned the ground ahead of the aircraft, and the echoes would appear as bright spots on the screen at the navigator's station. As the bomber crews became more familiar with using H-2S, they could find and pinpoint their targets in Germany. By 1942, the electronic war was becoming one of the most important battles waged between the two sides.
One of the most unfortunate things that happened to Bomber Command was that their ideal blind bombing device, H-2S, because it was radar, gave off emissions, the Germans were able to home in on it.
The technical war was based not only on developing your own innovations, but also responding to what the other side was doing. When the Germans recovered a partially intact model of H-2S from a crashed aircraft, they created Naxos, which could detect H-2S from as far away as 60 miles.
It was one of these things where you could get a leg up using a device, but in the end that leg up became a vulnerability because the enemy took advantage of it.
The challenge for the British was to find the targets. The challenge for the Germans was to prevent them from reaching them. The most visible and perhaps the last line of defense was flak. The backbone of the German flak was the famous 88.
Das Geschütz ist 360 Grad drehbar. Das Höhenrichtfeld geht von -3 bis +90 Grad. Die Gemeinschaft dieses Geschützes waren 10 Leute.
50 years later, Bob Pratt can still recall the effects of flak.
Scared hell out of you, to be exact. And anybody who wasn't scared, I would say they're not here with us today.
In addition to the flak from the German ground defenses, they still had to contend with the night fighters and an even deadlier new technical innovation. Early 1943, the Luftwaffe night fighting force sprang a nasty surprise on Bomber Command.
What was beginning to happen was that bombers were just blowing up And nobody was reporting attacks and nobody saw fighters.
So now the idea was to go under the target and just to get him there and to shoot him right away from this position instead of being behind what we had done before. This was quite a shock for the British.
The key to firing from below was the upward guns, or Schrägermusik. This was one of the most important technical advances for the German night fighters. 1 or 2 upward-firing cannon were mounted on the spine of the fuselage at an angle of 60 or 80 degrees forward. A sight was then mounted on the canopy above the pilot. As the German night fighters extracted a heavy toll with the Schrägermusik, the Allied Bomber Command disregarded aircrew reports of seeing slanted flashes from below.
Eventually, however, when bombing photos captured one in a raid photograph, it was admitted, but there was nothing you could do other than to tell your rear gunner to look outside and over the turret.
We were shooting between the 2 engines, left side or right side, between the 2 nacelles. Primarily because there were the fuel tanks, but also to give those fellas a chance to jump out, to parachute.
Five decades later, Peter Spoden can still recall shooting down his first Lancaster.
Yeah, that was on the 18th of August 1943, during the attack of Peenemünde. So in this case, when I was up in the air, we were told by our ground control people, all Kakadu's was that nickname for the fighters, all Kakadu's to Berlin, alle Flugzeuge nach Berlin, alle Nightfighter Berlin.
This turned out to be a false alarm, as only the Mosquito Pathfinders were there. Spoden climbed up to 6,000 meters to gain a better view of the surrounding landscape.
I saw something in the north happening, a lot of fire. And that was the real attack on Peenemünde, which is about 150, 200 kilometers away in the north from Berlin. With that high altitude I had.
Spoden, seeing the bombing, hurtled his Messerschmitt towards the action.
We went down with high speed and we could just get the last bombers. And I had a high speed, I remember that, and I saw my son this 4-engine plane, and I was shooting idiotically. Later on I did better, but he did not respond, and he was burning. He went down, and I watched him the whole time when he was going down, and then my radio operator cried, "Der Boden, Leute, der Boden, it's ground." And I was pulling up like this, but this fellow, of course, went down. And it was then close to Peenemünde that I got my first Lancaster.
After 30 operations, the Allied air crews were assigned other duties. The Germans weren't so lucky. They continued to fly until they were shot down or the war ended, whichever came first.
It was in August 1943. And I remember it was a heavy attack on Berlin, and I came over Berlin, and there was a spot 30, 40 kilometers burning, a real area bombing. And I saw the bombers, I saw the Messerschmitt 109 from Hajo Hermann, the Wildesau, the Wilde Bohr. And then there were 50, 60 planes, and there were searchlights. And the anti-aircraft was firing. It was like hell.
As Spoden was flying over Berlin, he engaged a British bomber. As it was burning, the British gunner returned fire.
I tell you, some of those rear gunners, they were even shooting on us while the Lancaster was going down, burning. So he got me. My left engine went out, was burning, and I cried again, "Let's get out, raus, raus, up, get out." And then I plunged against the elevator.
Spoden ejected, but was snagged on the tail of the aircraft.
I was caught on the elevator with the legs behind and the body above, and then the plane was spinning down. And I could hardly get off the elevator. I tried everything, and I tell you frankly, I cried for my mother. I said, "Mother, help me, Mother, help me." Mother helped.
Spoden was miraculously freed from the elevator and managed to parachute to safety, although he ended up with one leg 2 inches shorter than the other. When Spoden was ready to resume flying duties, he was assigned a Junkers 88 to replace his aging Messerschmitt 110.
It was much faster and better than the 110.
The Ju-88 was powered by 2 12-cylinder engines, which could produce more power than 5 modern BMW cars. With a crew of pilot, navigator, gunner, and up to 2 radar operators, the Junkers could fly 280 miles per hour. It also had a longer range than the Me-110. By the summer of 1943, the German defenses were at their zenith. However, any defensive system has an Achilles heel. The Himmelbett zone was no exception. The entire system was dependent on radar, and radar, as both sides now knew, could be jammed. On a warm summer evening in 1943, a massive stream of bombers headed for the northern German port of Hamburg. Once more, the German night fighters were scrambled to their radar patrol zones, again strictly controlled from the ground. In addition to the lethal payloads the bombers carried in their bellies, they were armed with a new weapon that would throw the entire German defenses into chaos. Codenamed Window, it would open a new era of the air war.
Window was an anti-radar, very simple one actually. It was metal foil strips in bundles. And don't ask me now how many strips were in a bundle.
These bundled strips of tinfoil were released from the incoming bombers. The foil was cut to exactly 1/2 of the length of the German radar's wavelength. That made each reflection seem like a separate aircraft. It completely overwhelmed the German air defenses with the appearance of millions of planes.
And these bundles would disperse as soon as it hit the air, and of course this would confuse the German radar.
The rigid nature of the Himmelbett system didn't allow the flexibility needed to rapidly respond to Window. This created frustration with the night fighters.
I was waiting there in the box, and nobody of those bombers went through my box. They all went to Hamburg. And I could see them. I could see like little moths over this we call it shroud, over this bright white overcast. And I told my control officer, let me go there, I see them. No, you have to wait, And I waited, I was mad.
You have to remember that pilots were there to shoot down bombers. And they experienced tremendous frustration if they felt that the guy on the ground who was directing them to an interception got them into the wrong place, so that there was no interception made.
Also festgestellt worden, dass unsere Geräte, die Würzburg-Geräte, einfach geblendet waren durch die Windows und praktisch die eigentlichen Ziele nicht orten konnte. Daher also auch die Nachtjäger, möchte ich sagen, wie früher im Dunkeln tapsten mussten und versuchten so jemanden zu finden. Daher waren die Erfolge sehr gering. Die Zerstörung in Hamburg waren gewaltig. Die Menschenverluste riesig durch die Feuerstürme, die sich dort entwickelt hatten, wo die Leute auf der Straße durch den Luftzug weggerissen wurden und verbrannten. Und es war also eine ausgesprochene Katastrophenstimmung.
Entgegen den Erwartungen und Hoffnungen unserer Feinde hat sich der Nachwuchs unserer Tag- und Nachtjäger hervorragend bewährt.
The blinding of the German radar system and the devastation of Hamburg made a former bomber pilot propose the use of single-engine day fighters in the night fighter role. While they had no onboard radar, the sky was illuminated by the glow from the burning city below. The bombers were stripped of their cloak of darkness.
I saw the first woman caught in the searchlight. Now I was in the turmoil there. There was a flak that fired from all cannons. You see, they were 1,000 cannons in Berlin. There were searchlights, and there were the bombers, and there were the fighters, all in that turmoil. And we deserved by this system the fine name Wild Boar, or Wilde Sau.
Flying in amongst the bomber streams over the targeted city exposed the night fighters not only to the machine guns of the bombers, but the flak being fired from below. Since the separation of flak from interceptors was difficult to maintain, chaos and tragedy were commonplace.
Der Nacht über Hamburg, da schoss die Heiligen Geist Flak hervorragend, aber nicht auf die Bomber der Engländer, sondern auf uns. Wenn man in der Maschine die Explosion hört, dann hat die auch irgendwie getroffen. So hat mir die Flak gewaltig unter Wind als Nachtjäger, weil die meistens dann auf uns schossen.
Ein Vorteil hatte diese freie Yacht der Wilden Sau, wenn eine Wolkendecke da war oder die Brände mit Rauchentwicklung so stark waren, dass sich über der Stadt eine, möchte ich sagen, Wolkenrauchdecke entwickelte, die von unten durch die Searchlights, durch die Scheinwerfer und durch die Brände erhellt wurden. Dann zeichneten sich die Bomber als Silhouetten wie die Fliegen auf der Mattscheibe ab und konnten natürlich leicht angegriffen werden.
As the Germans tried to find a way to see through the electronic storm created by window, Bomber Command struck at the other vulnerable pillar of the Himmelbett system, the ground-to-air radio control. The deadly dance of electronic measure and countermeasure that started in the Night Air War is still rehearsed by air forces today. 50 years ago, they were still learning the steps.
The British adopted a countermeasure which they codenamed Corona, in which they got German speakers to broadcast over the same frequency as the Luftwaffe night fighter controller and give conflicting directions to the night fighter pilots.
Das heißt also, bekam meinetwegen Antreten nach Köln und die Stimme aus England sagte, Antreten nach Hamburg.
The British also broadcast recordings of Hitler's speeches to drown out the German controllers.
Das war also die Reportage, die dann gestört wurde, die zum Teil auch über Störsender gestört wurde. Und als einer der Auswege galt dann das Abspielen von Musik, das heißt Walzer, wenn ein Angriff auf München bevorstand, Marschmusik, wenn ein Angriff auf Berlin oder auf Hamburg bevorstand. Das ging dann über schwere Sender, das heißt die deutschen Rundfunksender spielten dann diese Musik ein.
The ears of the night fighters themselves were the target of another jamming technique called tinsel. Microphones were installed beside the bombers' engines.
It was keyed back, wired back into our radio sets, and we were told before we took off, the wireless operators, that to search a certain band, a frequency band.
When the wireless operators found the German night fighters or controller operating on that frequency, they keyed the microphone for 2 or 3 seconds.
Reason being that they could maybe vector back onto you, but that one must have created an awful lot of confusion in the German. Must have blasted his ears off, frankly. I've often thought about that over the years.
As the electronic war continued, the Germans devised a way to counter the effects of window.
The Germans realized if they tracked the window, if they tracked this great line of jamming on their radars, they could direct night fighters from all over Germany into the bomber stream simply by directing them to the coordinates of the window. And that's what they did.
The war was becoming a battle of science and a race of developing technologies. Yet what never changes is the one emotion that has found its way into every conflict.
Fear became your companion, and you learned to live with it. Did you like it? No. No one would.
The fear never left. It never left you. And we were one of the original crews on our squadron. As it got closer and closer, you figured, well, is this the trip that we're going to get it?
Bomber Command demanded a great deal from their young crews. The Night War created a battle of electronics which changed the nature of warfare. As the war began to shift in the Allies' favor, the melding of tactics and technology was now approaching a science which would be tested to the fullest in the final aerial battles. Battles which would put the air crews to the ultimate test.
I've been asked many times, how old were you when you started the war? And I said 18. And they said, oh, and how old were you when you finished? And I said 85. And I think that sums it up.